I'll be the first one to say that when you look into the scientific evidence of Mildronate and some of the other compounds which were developed by the USSR, all of that scientific evidence was also funded by the pharmaceutical companies that developed these companies. So you have to read between the lines a little bit. Vigorous Steve here with part 3 of the Optimized Endurance Deep Dive video series. And in this segment, we're finally going to discuss the performance-enhancing drugs, but it's going to be a multiple-part segment. I think part 3, 4, and 5, all about PED. So for all of you enhanced individuals out there, rejoice. The next couple of videos, all about performance-enhancing drugs in the context of optimizing one's endurance and stamina and overall performance during long-distance sports. So in this video, this part 3, I want to discuss how to optimize your neural steroids and sex hormone panel with hormone replacement therapy, and how to optimize your mitochondrial function further compared to the mitochondrial support stack, which I already released a couple months ago. So this is basically part 2 of the mitochondrial support stack, but there's a couple more compounds that I want to discuss for the actual mitochondrial support stack part 2, which we'll review a little bit in this video. And then in consecutive parts regarding your endurance, we're going to discuss how to optimize oxygen carrying capacity, cardiac function, skeletal muscle function, how to remove lactic acid and deal with the lactate buildup, reducing inflammation, and then probably also all of the unclassified PEDs, which don't really fall in any of these categories, but still optimize your overall endurance. So this is going to be a multiple part segment. All of these will include the WADA status, mainly for the guys who compete in sports that are subject to drug testing, so you can keep this in mind. But if you want to know how to beat the WADA doping test regarding the overall detection times and the clearance of metabolites, that's exactly what the consultations are there for. You can find the link down below. Before we get into it, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if you want to support the channel or vote for upcoming deep dives or join the weekly Vigorous Q&A, which is always on Saturday, you can do so by joining the Patreon or YouTube memberships. Information down below as well. Let's get started with cookie cutter hormone replacement therapy. And the main reason why we're not going into full-blown steroid cycles and just limiting it to HRT only is because full-blown steroid cycles actually hinder your endurance by raising your overall oxygen requirement and raising your overall energy demands by raising your muscle mass. So anything over HRT is generally not recommended. And even though I'm well aware that Anadrol and Boldenone and Primobolan and a lot of the other anabolic steroids are able to increase overall oxygen carrying capacity, when it comes to endurance, you're better off looking into something like EPO than using Anadrol to increase your hematocrit and red blood cell count, right? We'll discuss that in part 4, which is part 2 of the PED segments. In this one, I would just want to discuss HRT, and another reason is because the movie AICAR, directed by Brian Fogel, clearly mentions that a lot of these endurance athletes, especially the cyclists that perform and race in the Tour de France, for example, they just use a low dose of testosterone to kind of complement their endogenous production or to kind of replace endogenous production when they're doing these long distance races. So in this video, just cookie cutter HRT consisting of testosterone, any ester, and ester of preference, 15 milligrams, so let's say to 35 milligrams subcutaneous daily. So that's anywhere between 105 to 245 milligrams testosterone, enanthate, cypionate, propionate, whatever you prefer, per week, right? Daily microadministrations for stable hormone levels. DHEA, anywhere between 12.5 to 25 milligrams morning and evening, as well as 5 to 12.5 milligrams pregnenolone, morning and evening, or either the full dose in the morning or full dose in the evening. You'll have to experiment with that and figure out what neurosteroid protocol works the best for you. So that's anywhere between 25 to 50 milligrams DHEA per day and 10 to 25 milligrams pregnenolone per day, and a little bit of human chorionic gonadotropin, whether it's urine purified or recombinant in the form of Merck Ovitrol, which is the one I prefer. 250 IUs to 500 IUs 3 times per week, let's say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, just to help with overall testicular function, all of the intermediary hormones. Make sure that you don't go infertile with prolonged HRT exposure, even though not everybody gets completely azoospermic when they supplement with a little bit exogenous testosterone and DHEA and pregnenolone. So again, this is just there as an insurance policy for testicular function and all of the intermediary hormones. Diethylmethane, 100 milligrams morning and evening, just for optimal estrogen balance between estrone, estradiol, and estriol. Aromasin, exemestane as needed, right? Do your blood work, see where your serum estradiol levels are at, and then potentially growth hormone 1 IU, 2 IUs before bed or before activity if you want a little bit of lipolysis and potentially initiate fat burning depending on the other performance enhancing drugs that you're using in this stack, because again, not all of the drugs are going hand in hand. Fat burners and some of the endurance medications should not be combined, but I'll classify that a little bit later. Now, the problem here already is that only diethylmethane is actually WADA approved. So if you're looking for a stack to raise your testosterone levels, which is WADA approved, go back to part 1 of the Optimized Endurance Deep Dive video series, where I discuss various over-the-counter supplements which are known to raise testicular function and give you extra testosterone in your serum naturally, right? WADA approved. In this stack, this hormone replacement therapy stack, you see that all of the other compounds are actually prohibited. Under S1, the anabolic agents, you can find testosterone and DHEA. And under S2, the peptide hormones, you see 2.1, chorionic gonadotropins, and 2.3, growth hormone. And then S4, the hormones and metabolic modulators, is exemestane, aromasin. So only pregnenolone, also forgot to mention that, but pregnenolone and diethylmethane are not included in the 2023 prohibited list. Let's move on and discuss how to optimize or at least modulate mitochondrial function. I'm not going to include all of the new compounds which are out there nowadays. I'll save them for the mitochondrial support stack part 2. In this video, I just want to optimize endurance, right? But when it comes to overall mitochondrial function, there's a lot more peptides and compounds that we can discuss, but we'll save that for the mitochondrial support stack part 2, right? Stay tuned for that. Subscribe now if you want to see that dropping in a couple of weeks. So this video will not include elamiprotide, also known as MTP-131 or SS31 or Bendavia, which improves mitochondrial dysfunction, might be useful for mitochondrial function, especially in certain contexts, but not really beneficial to optimize your endurance. Same goes for mitochondria-targeted peptide SPT20, also known as SS20, which reduces mitochondrial inflammation and oxidative stress, beneficial for mitochondrial health. And we will discuss mitochondria-targeted antioxidant SKQ1 or mitoquinone, also known as MitoQ, which I did mention briefly in the mitochondrial support stack part 1, that it didn't really do much for me, but a lot of you guys mentioned that MitoQ actually had some benefits. So again, I'll include that in part 2. Won't be discussed in this video because I feel that they don't do much for overall endurance. What does do a lot for endurance, and this is exactly what you guys are after, all of the drugs which were designed by the old Soviet Union, the USSR. Let's start with Mildronate. Finally, Mildronate, also known as Meldonium or quaterine, developed by the USSR, now part of Russia and Latvia, available as a generic medication, but the commonly used pharmaceutical version is produced by the Latvian pharmaceutical company JSC Grindex. That's the Mildronate that we're all familiar with. Unfortunately, Mildronate is on the prohibited list, so it's technically not allowed by WADA. It's found under 4.4 metabolic modulators, 4.4.3 Meldonium. So keep that in mind, Meldonium, Mildronate, quaterine, not WADA approved, but still readily used. And when you go to the Wikipedia page of Meldonium, you see that a lot of Russian and Ukrainian and other Soviet countries, a lot of these athletes are actually failing for Mildronate. So it's readily used. You can find all of the details on the screen. Basically what it does, Mildronate inhibits enzymes which contribute to carnitine synthesis. And this way, energy metabolism shifts from fatty acid oxidation within the mitochondria purely to glucose, right? This is a short version. There's a lot more to be said, but to keep it simple, basically Mildronate, Meldonium, shifts energy consumption from fatty acids purely to glucose. So that also means that carnitine supplementation or fat burners which heavily rely on fatty acid oxidation and carnitine synthesis or supplemental carnitine, those are off the menu. So something like injectable carnitine or oral L-carnitine L-tartrate or clenbuterol or ephedrine or ribosine or yohimbine or GW1516 or SR9009 to a certain extent, or anything that relies or promotes fatty acid oxidation should not be combined with Mildronate because it kind of defeats the purpose. All of the fatty acids will never enter the mitochondria and might now get stored in the skeletal muscle, ruining insulin sensitivity over time. So it's very important to understand that Mildronate goes very well with something like insulin, but doesn't go well with something like growth hormone or some of the other fat burners, which I just mentioned. It also goes well with a high carbohydrate diet, but doesn't go well with a high fat diet. So when I ran Mildronate, I excluded all of the fat sources, all of the direct fat sources. I mean, you won't technically inhibit fatty acid oxidation to the maximum extent, to the point that fatty acids are purely accumulating in skeletal muscle cells or adipose tissue, right? You're not going to get fat running Mildronate, but still it's inhibited to a great extent. And thus, dietary fat intake should be limited to maybe 50 grams per day. And this also brings another issue with it. Mildronate courses shouldn't last longer than 3 weeks. So depending on how much of an endurance boost you want, by inhibiting the fatty acid oxidation and just lowering your overall oxygen demand by purely focusing and shifting energy consumption to glucose, I would say that limiting it to 3 weeks at maximum is ideal, right? 21 days in duration. And after that, you take an equal amount of time off, and you might have to supplement with carnitine because, again, some of these drugs, especially Mildronate, have a long half-life, up to 15 hours. So even if you discontinue it, you might still get this carnitine synthesizing or synthesis inhibiting effects for several days after the last dose. So again, take some time off after Mildronate, but the time that you're using Mildronate, high carbs, potentially insulin, right, depending on your tolerance and the sports that you're following, that might be very, very beneficial. Solely limit your diet to low-fat protein sources and low-fat carbohydrate sources with a little bit of vegetables here and there to clean your intestinal tract. No added fats, unless it's coming from fish oil supplements, for example, or vitamin K or some of the other fat-soluble vitamins. 50 grams fat per day for this Mildronate to work, especially if you're combining that with some of the other drugs or insulin, for example. Now, dosages range anywhere between 250 to 1,000 milligrams Mildronate 30 to 60 minutes pre-workout, or 250 milligrams multiple times over the day on the rest day to kind of keep the inhibiting effects going, because I did notice that when I would stop Mildronate for a single day or 2 days, that my performance and endurance for consecutive days was slightly impaired. It would still take a couple days for this maximum effect to kind of build up. So I would limit it between 250 to 1,000 milligrams per day, up to 21 days in duration, and then take an equal amount of days off. So 21 days on, 21 days off, with something to kind of restore fatty acid oxidation, perhaps with supplemental carnitine, because again, you don't want to inhibit fat loss for that long. Otherwise, you might have issues with overall fat loss or insulin sensitivity or other metabolic issues, right? So don't use it too long. Mildronate basically works by increasing the efficiency of oxygen utilization in cells, again, by shifting from fatty acid oxidation to glucose oxidation, and thus improves oxygen consumption and utilization. Mildronate enhances aerobic performance and delays the onset of fatigue during long-distance endurance sports. There's also some evidence that Mildronate actually reduces the formation of TMAO, trimethylamine N oxide, which is a metabolic waste product from carnitine or creatine or choline consumption, right, which has been implicated in cardiovascular disease. So there's a lot of benefits when you look into Mildronate, at least the scientific evidence. But I'll be the first one to say that when you look into the scientific evidence of Mildronate and some of the other compounds which were developed by the USSR, all of that scientific evidence was also funded by the pharmaceutical companies that developed these companies. So you have to read between the lines a little bit. Some of these, medical applications of these drugs are a little bit far-fetched, I would say, and don't really translate into the real world or are not beneficial for athletes in the context of optimizing your endurance. It's basically the same as when creatine came to market. You had creatine monohydrate, still the best form of creatine out there, and then a million other formulas and variants of creatine came to market, and all of the scientific evidence was funded by the patent holder, right? So take it all with a grain of salt. Limited scientific evidence to sift through. Mildronate and all the other USSR developed medications in this video aren't exactly FDA approved in the Western world. Still, they will tremendously improve your endurance if you use them responsibly. Right, there's something to say for Mildronate regarding cardioprotective effects or neuroprotective effects. Personally, I didn't notice much of a benefit regarding nootropic effects for cognition or memory or productivity etc. Right? For that, I would use actual nootropics, but still, some of the scientific literature, and know a lot of people out there that notice a cognitive benefit or boost when they're using Mildronate for a couple of weeks in duration. So do your due diligence researching. Personally, it's one of the more potent endurance drugs in this video, but there's a lot more to discuss, so let's just move on to Bemethyl, which I also really like, but only once per week. The effects of Bemethyl are very long-lasting. Luckily for everybody out there, Bemethyl is not included in the 2023 prohibited list, but it was added to the WADA monitoring list in 2018, but it's not included in the 2023 monitoring program. So a little bit of a discrepancy here. Is it on the monitoring program, or was it already taken off because it's not included in the 2023 version? So it's technically approved. The half-life, though, currently unknown. It's speculated to be several days. What I noticed from a single dose of Bemethyl is that the effects regarding the anti-hypoxic effects and the overall performance-boosting effects, they are long-lasting, several days. I would say that's anywhere between 5 to 7 days. When you look into the medical insert of Bemethyl, it recommends 5-day courses between 250 to 1,000 milligrams, depending on the particular medical situation that it's prescribed for. Again, only in Russia and Belarus and some of the other Soviet countries that fell under the USSR where Bemethyl is prescribed in various medical applications, they recommend a 5-day course at maximum and then taking a significant time off. So from a personal experimentation, I would say that you should limit it to 8 doses of 250 milligrams Bemethyl. Some people prefer 500 milligrams. I was 110 kilos at the time, and I got all of the benefits from a single dose of 250 milligrams regarding the improvement of endurance. But I'm a big, muscly meathead, and I don't exactly do a long-distance races. So maybe you need to increase the dose of Bemethyl to 500 milligrams, or maybe even 1,000 milligrams, what the medical insert recommends. Again, for medical issues, not for improving your endurance. So you'll have to experiment a little bit because, again, the data is limited and there's not so many people that use it in the Western world. But I'm sure if you go to Russia or Belarus, a ton of people use Bemethyl for recreational purposes and probably longer than 5 days consecutively. For bodybuilding purposes, I would say a single dose of 250 milligrams before leg day for its anti-hypoxic effect and anti-ischemic and antioxidant and nootropic benefits, right? You do get a little bit of a focus boost when it comes to Bemethyl. 250 milligrams once per week for 8 weeks in duration, and then taking significant time off, right? That single dose will still last into consecutive workouts, but from the people that I talk to that use Bemethyl for endurance, some of them might use 250 milligrams to 500 milligrams every single day for 8 days consecutively, right? And then after that, they take maybe an equal time off. I did talk to one guy who used Bemethyl every day for like 6 months in duration, no adverse effects, but the scientific literature is quite limited, so I would not overdo it and maybe wait for more publications to come regarding the side effects and, how it affects your liver health and lipid levels and your kidney markers and that kind of stuff, because again, not so much evidence to go by. So basically, Bemethyl is an actoprotectant. That means it's a synthetic adaptogen with significant capacity to increase physical performance. Exactly what I notice and many of my clients notice that use Bemethyl for endurance. Bemethyl enhances the cell resilience to physical stress without increasing body temperature or heat output. So for the guys that do races in hot climates, or, like me, when you train in the gym without air conditioning, you notice that your body temperature is actually sustained. You have less of heat output through a strenuous exercise. So I only used it on leg day, which is basically the hottest workout of the week. Again, training in the gym without air conditioning. But if you do long distance races in the desert or anywhere where it's kind of hot, the south of Spain or other places where they do, cycling or other endurance sports, very, very beneficial. But where Bemethyl really shines is in its anti-hypoxic effect. So that means if you suffer from hypoxia due to a low oxygen environment, high altitude, for example, or very strenuous workouts, when there's low oxygen in the body, it simply can't function correctly. So you might get confusion, restlessness, difficulty breathing, a rapid heart rate, or even bluish skin, which I'm sure many of you guys have seen on some of the pro bodybuilders. When they do strenuous sets, their back gets bluish skin. So that's a state of hypoxia that only happens when you're very, very large or train with very high volume and blast through your workout very, very fast. So this is why I prefer Bemethyl on leg day. This is the most strenuous workout of the week. But again, if you do endurance work, especially at high altitude or hot environments, Bemethyl, highly beneficial. So basically what I noticed experimenting with Bemethyl is that I'm no longer out of breath, not during leg day, not doing strenuous cardio on the elliptical or the Stairmaster. No issues with breathing, especially when combining it with Mildronate. But since the pharmacological effects of these drugs are not very well understood and documented, it might not be a good idea to combine Mildronate with Bemethyl because there's not so much data to pull from. I do know several people who run both compounds at the same time and say that they're breezing through workouts like nothing else. They're basically never out of breath, whether that's physical activity in the form of bodybuilding or strength exercise or endurance sports. They can basically hold their breath and not have any issues or issues with body temperature because it's such of a dramatic effect. Still, limited practical applications or at least literature to pull from. So respect these compounds because we don't really know how the drug interactions are because they're not very well documented. Besides that, Bemethyl has potent antioxidant and anti-mutagenic effects, might be able to prevent permanent hearing loss and facilitate recovery after mine explosion. So again, a lot of various niche medical applications that Bemethyl might have, and it might actually improve total cholesterol and bilirubin levels as well. Now, again, Bemethyl is metabolism resistant and has long-lasting effects, so you have to respect it. Maybe once or twice per week, I would say, is more than sufficient. But if you're ramping up for a particular endurance sport that involves drug testing, and that way you have an edge over the contestants who are not using Bemethyl. But again, it's not included in the WIDA doping list. So that might mean that everybody else is already on Bemethyl and you need to supplement your Bemethyl in just to win the race or get anywhere close to a top 3 placing. Moving over to Hypoxen, which is very similar to Bemethyl, also an anti-hypoxic, adaptogen, antioxidant nootropic, and is also used for alcohol withdrawal aids. Hypoxen is not included in the 2023 prohibited list or monitoring program, but the United States Anti-Doping Agency applied to have Hypoxen banned from athletic competitions in 2017. But luckily for everybody that is, adhering to the WIDA doping list, this ban was not implemented. So it's on basically the eyes of the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, another swear word when it comes to people who take performance-enhancing drugs. WIDA and USADA, shivers down my spine with content, not because I'm scared. But it's these people have to be there for the sports to appear legitimate to general population. And again, Hypoxen and Bemethyl are very similar in its overall anti-hypoxic effects. But I would say that a low dose of Bemethyl, 250 milligrams once or twice per week, is more beneficial regarding endurance compared to 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams Hypoxen every single day. But maybe the discrepancy here is because I used Bemethyl in combination with Mildronate at various dosages, and I used Hypoxen by itself up to 2,000 milligrams per day for a week in duration. And I was also using the mitochondrial support stack in both contexts, but Hypoxen primarily works by enhancing the production of ATP. And if you're already on an extensive mitochondrial support stack, how much of a difference is Hypoxen going to make? So from my personal experience with various drug combination, I would say that a combination of Mildronate and Bemethyl is more beneficial for your endurance and overall oxygenation and the reducing, symptoms of hypoxia in, long distance endurance sports over using Hypoxen and, the first part of the mitochondrial support stack in combination. But if you can do all, maybe that's where, these compounds really shines, if it's even doable to combine all of them together. I didn't do it, so you'll be the first one to run an experiment. I haven't talked to anybody who has combined all of these compounds together. Hypoxen optimizes mitochondrial function, enhances tissue respiration and mitochondrial aerobic respiration, and thus reduces the negative effects of hypoxia. And these effects combined basically improve endurance and mental performance as well. Through its enhanced production of ATP, it has been suggested that Hypoxen can be a very potent vasodilator because ATP can convert into AMP, and AMP is quite a potent vasodilator. So through its vasodilating effects, again, I didn't really notice this, but I'm on other compounds which are known to be vasodilators. Hypoxen can actually enhance oxygen delivery and even reduce, again, the negative effects of hypoxia, in a double whammy, so to say, by having this vasodilating effect. something I noticed that my stamina was improved, but through the various combination of medications and drugs that I was using, I did not notice such a dramatic effect. And the other beneficial effects of Hypoxen include very potent antioxidant properties, might help with alcohol withdrawal or cases of alcohol abuse, and it was also shown that Hypoxen can reduce heart damage caused by myocardial infarction. So there's a lot of benefits related to Hypoxen, albeit that a lot of the studies, again, performed in Russia by the manufacturer of Hypoxen, and many of these studies have been translated and are reasonably old. Not a lot of new studies performed on Hypoxen, so keep that in mind. Moving over to Emoxypine, also known as Mexidol or Mexifen. This compound is actually very similar to Hypoxen in its overall effects, albeit that I prefer Emoxypine over Hypoxen because I feel that my workout intensity is sustained longer and the overall endurance boost that I get out of Emoxypine is much more pronounced. When I take Emoxypine before fasted cardio, for example, I'm literally breezing through my session, like some of the other compounds which are known to improve fat burning, albeit that Emoxypine is not generally known as a fat burning aid. So I prefer Emoxypine over Hypoxen also because the dosing protocol of Emoxypine is a lot lower, so you get a much more pronounced effect for a much lower dosage compared to Hypoxen. That being said, both of them are classified as an antioxidant, both have anti-hypoxic effects, both are said to improve microcirculation, but again, at a lower dose, all of these effects are much more pronounced with Emoxypine over Hypoxen. I would look into Emoxypine purely as a replacement or a supercharged version of ubiquinol. I've mentioned ubiquinol several different times on this YouTube channel in various different videos. Ubiquinol improves heart function, improves your workout performance, improves your overall endurance and stamina. So look into this compound specifically as an enhanced version of ubiquinol because the overlap and the effects are actually very similar. So instead of taking 400 milligrams ubiquinol pre-workout, you can get away with maybe 125 to 250 milligrams Emoxypine instead. So you have to look into it this way. In the beginning of your workout, whether that's for strength or endurance, you get a similar effect. But towards the end of your workout, when you're starting to get tired otherwise, ubiquinol, or in this case Emoxypine, is actually sustaining the intensity. So instead of having this gradual dip towards the end and then you're freaking tired, maybe a couple hours into the race, with ubiquinol, which you might have to dose several times, like I mentioned in the supplements videos, with Emoxypine, a single dose, because its half-life is far longer lasting compared to ubiquinol. With Emoxypine, you dose it at the start of your workout, whether that's, again, for strength or for endurance, and you notice that you don't really dip off. You just stay sustained at a high capacity, the same capacity of intensity that you had at the start of your workout. So this is why I prefer Emoxypine over Hypoxen and even ubiquinol in certain conditions, but I still prefer ubiquinol for workouts that revolve around hypertrophy or strength. Plus, there's a lot more scientific evidence when it comes to ubiquinol compared to Emoxypine. Ubiquinol has been well documented on PubMed, and Emoxypine, besides a couple of scientific literature that stems from the USSR, now Russia, probably funded, again, by the manufacturer of Emoxypine, Mexidol, Mexifen, there's not so much clinical evidence that we can use in the context of improving cardiac function or overall endurance or strength training for that matter. But when it comes to endurance, though, Emoxypine wins hands down, probably also because the effects are much longer lasting compared to ubiquinol or Hypoxen. Now, besides its potent antioxidant and vasodilating effects, Emoxypine is also has neuroprotective effects, and I certainly noticed that it has some nootropic benefits. So besides neuroprotective properties that might enhance brain function, Emoxypine can also improve cognitive performance, improve concentration, mental stamina, and overall cognitive function during prolonged exercise. Something that I noticed that I was more dialed in. Now again, this is without other nootropics in the picture, so I would just run Emoxypine for a couple sessions in replacement of ubiquinol for the couple experiments that I ran a couple weeks ago. So basically, long story short, I felt a lot more dialed in, a lot more tunnel vision during the workouts, and for a couple hours afterwards getting work done, or during daily fasted cardio when I experimented with Emoxypine here and there. But this tunnel vision, this being dialed in feeling is actually very similar to most nootropic formulas out there, like Gorilla Mind Respawn or Gorilla Mode Nitric for that matter, or Gorilla Mind Smooth, right? All of these nootropics have overlapping beneficial effects when it comes to cognition. So when you take this before the workout, I'm talking about Emoxypine here, then you're simply more dialed in, more focused, And again, time kind of flies by because again, it doesn't really feel like your endurance intensity and capacity starts tapering down towards the end. And now you're at a spot where you feel like not really stopping your endurance work because you're still training at such a high capacity compared to the beginning of your workout, right? So all of these things are highly beneficial. The recommended dosages for endurance and overall cognitive performance are anywhere between 125 milligrams to 250 milligrams once to 3 times per day. I've talked to people who take Emoxypine 250 milligrams 3 times per day, but they're not really on top of all of the other antioxidants, which I mentioned in part 1 and 2. So if you're really taking a lot of antioxidants and you're training for endurance or hypertrophy or strength for that matter, I feel that a single dose, 125 to 250 milligrams Emoxypine pre-workout, is more than enough for its overall and all of its beneficial effects. Moving over to AICAR, not to be mistaken though for ALCAR. Both of these compounds are vastly different, albeit that both AICAR and ALCAR improve fatty acid oxidation. You can actually combine AICAR with ALCAR together to improve your fat loss and to improve your overall endurance and stamina during workouts. AICAR stands for 5-amino-imidazole 4-carboxamide ribonucleotide, and ALCAR stands for acetyl L-carnitine. So again, different compounds, very similar abbreviations, but the dosing protocol is going to be vastly different. AICAR is included in the WADA prohibited list. Under 4.4 metabolic modulators, there's AICAR specifically, just before SR9009 stenabolic and GW1516 cardarine, which we'll discuss in another video because they don't really have to do so much with mitochondrial function. AICAR, though, is an analog nucleotide derivative of adenosine monophosphate and actually improves ATP synthesis within the mitochondria. It's also a very potent vasodilator. It's actually an anti-diabetic and, of course, classified as a performance-enhancing drug. And certainly the effects are very noticeable when you start injecting AICAR. Personally, I've never used it, though, so we can't really go with anecdotal experience. But I've talked to several people during consultations who have used AICAR themselves. The problem is, because of its short half-life, you either need to inject it sub-Q intramuscular or intravenously, basically directly before your endurance session. Now, if you inject it subcutaneous or intramuscular, you might get away with a 30 minutes to 60 minutes before your workouts. But intravenous is basically right before you get on the bike, or right before you start swimming, or right before your match, whatever else it is that you need to boost your endurance for. Dosages range anywhere between 25 milligrams to 100 milligrams pre-workouts. I've read some reports of people using 500 milligrams AICAR intravenously directly before their endurance work, but personally I would say that that's too high. You would get too much of a vasodilating effect. Again, it might be beneficial in certain contexts, but I've never really talked to anybody who've taken Dutchman AICAR in a single dose. Still, the people that I talked to, they said 25 to 50 milligrams AICAR intravenously or intramuscularly before a race or endurance work is much more pronounced compared to Amino Asylum Super Shredder or Stampede. So please thread carefully because AICAR, very, very potent, allegedly. I don't have any personal experience with it, but it's on my to-do list. As soon as my wife is pregnant and I can source some AICAR, which I found a couple sources which host it, we'll try that experiment for myself. So basically, long story short, AICAR is an analog intermediate in the generation of adenosine monophosphate, which stimulates AMP-activated protein kinase, AMPK activity, the enzyme that regulates energy metabolism within the cells. An activation of AMPK by AICAR actually leads to increased glucose uptake, improved fatty acid oxidation, and stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, and even increases insulin sensitivity. And AICAR is known to promote angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels, similarly to TB500 and BPC157. But a little bit of caution is advised if you have undiagnosed cancer. You don't want too much angiogenesis because now the cancer can grow faster. So maybe you get diagnosed, run all of your cancer markers through blood work first before you start experimenting with AICAR, which is something I will certainly do when I get my hands on it and I run an experiment, right? I'll check my cancer markers every year anywhere, just as an insurance policy. Now, again, it improves AMP and ATP synthesis and thus enhances fat burning, improves blood flow and oxygen delivery. So it's very similar to citrulline malate, albeit much more pronounced, right? So AICAR is basically the best of all of the pre-workout supplements in a single injection. And then the last compound I want to discuss, a compound that many of you guys have pointed out in the Mitochondrial Support Stack Deep Dive Part 1 in the comment section. Steve, what about methylene blue, bro? Methylene blue is the best oxygenator on the planet. And yes, I did my research on methylene blue, but unfortunately, it kind of turned me off that it's a synthetic dye. And the last time I took a synthetic dye or an explosive or rat poison, DMP, I had a pretty adverse reaction for the couple days that I ran it. So I didn't get a chance to experiment or had any incentive to experiment with methylene blue, but I heard many good anecdotal reports since then. And I've talked to a couple people who brought it up that methylene blue was very beneficial to improve their overall endurance. So I might run that experiment again a couple months from now after my wife is pregnant and I'm back on the performance-enhancing drug train. So methylene blue is not included in the 2023 prohibited list or monitoring program. So again, we got the green light there. Methylene blue has various mitochondrial effects, enhancing mitochondrial function and efficiency, increasing the production of ATP by acting as a redox agent in the electron transfer chain. Now, that's very similar to ubiquinol or some of the other compounds which we discussed in the mitochondrial support stack or part 1 and 2 when we mentioned how to improve your overall endurance using various over-the-counter supplements. So there's a lot of overlap with some of the other compounds which can improve your overall endurance. Again, it's not included in the doping list, but I would classify methylene blue as a drug because it's basically used as a synthetic dye and it's also prescribed in cases of severe malaria. So I would classify it more as a drug than an over-the-counter supplement, albeit that it's still readily available on some of the gray area websites. It's a very potent antioxidant. It has vasodilating effects, similar to some of the drugs which you mentioned previously. A dose of 25 milligrams to 100 milligrams, 30 to 60 minutes pre-workout seems to be the sweet spot for most people. But again, I don't really know if that holds up when you're combining methylene blue with some of the other drugs that we mentioned and are going to mention in consecutive parts. This is just the first part of the segment about performance-enhancing drugs. If you have experience with AICAR or methylene blue, please write a little bit of a report down below in the comment section so we have a little bit more anecdotal reports to pull data from for the guys that are interested in AICAR and methylene blue. I'm certainly interested, but it's on my very far to-do list because, again, I got to do a couple other things in the meantime, and I'm not as physically fit anyway to benefit from AICAR or methylene blue currently. But for now, we're out of time. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the YouTube description section. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Vigorous Steve, a Vigorous crew. You guys know what to do. A frontal bicep for you guys, not too focused on my endurance or body composition for that matter currently, but when I get back on my PED journey, you bet your left testicle that my endurance and stamina will be boosted to the max using some of the PEDs that I discussed in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.